The story begins before the sun fully rose, when the plantation lay under a heavy mist, each tree and field blurred into a palette of gray and green, and every sound seemed amplified by the stillness of the morning. There was a chill in the air, not from temperature alone but from an unspoken tension that pervaded the grounds, as if the land itself was holding its breath. A figure moved quietly among the shadows, her presence unannounced yet immediately felt, as though the very space recognized her and adjusted in anticipation. Those who had seen her before spoke of a calm that was not ordinary, a serenity interlaced with an unshakable awareness, the kind that suggested she could read the intentions of anyone in the vicinity before they themselves were conscious of them. The household stirred slowly, servants carrying out their early tasks with a sense of routine, but beneath each step, there was a heightened attentiveness, a subtle expectation that something beyond ordinary life might intrude upon the day. The patriarch moved from room to room, inspecting the plantation as he always did, yet his pace was uneven, his thoughts fragmented by the recollection of incidents that defied explanation. He glanced toward the quarters, toward the kitchens and the edges of the fields, sensing rather than seeing a presence that had previously influenced behavior, altered perception, and commanded subtle respect. The air seemed to carry her silently, and those sensitive to the nuances of human emotion felt it like a weight pressing lightly against their consciousness. Outside, the enslaved population began their morning labor, carrying tools and buckets with a careful precision that belied ordinary effort. There was an almost imperceptible tension among them, a mixture of respect, fear, and curiosity that had been cultivated over time. The smallest gestures, how a hand moved across a work surface, the placement of a footstep, or a glance toward the house, were imbued with awareness. Many had learned that observation was as essential as action, that subtlety in motion could prevent attention from being drawn in ways that might invite danger or consequence. Yet even in these precautions, there was acknowledgement of her influence, remembered in detail and guiding behavior without overt instruction. That morning, a particular incident caught the attention of both family and laborers. A bird, startled by no visible movement, flew across the central courtyard, its wings beating with an erratic urgency. A tool, left in the sun the previous evening, had shifted inexplicably from one side of the porch to another. Shadows fell in unusual patterns, as though the sun and the earth conspired to create shapes that hinted at observation. Those present did not speak of these occurrences immediately, instead, their minds catalogued, measured, and adjusted, a silent acknowledgement of a presence that had once mediated their interactions with precision. Every subtle change in environment, every inexplicable detail, was noted and internalized, shaping expectations and reactions. The patriarch attempted to reassert the ordinary through ritual inspection, moving methodically from the house to the fields, speaking occasionally with overseers and servants. Yet even as he issued commands and sought to maintain order, there was a dissonance in the responses he received. Laborers paused, glanced around, and continued with a care that suggested more than simple obedience. Their attentiveness carried memory, experience, and perhaps fear, a lingering influence that had not been erased by absence or time. The patriarch's efforts to establish certainty were subtly undermined by the presence of her memory, an intangible yet undeniable force that shaped perception and behavior across the plantation. Children watched from doorways and staircases, their small hands gripping railings as their eyes followed movement and listened for the faintest sound. They had grown accustomed to noticing anomalies, an object slightly out of place, a shadow that lingered longer than expected, a sound that could not be traced to a source. These early experiences shaped their understanding of authority, perception, and the boundaries of ordinary life. The ordinary morning, for them, was infused with layers of awareness and interpretation, each movement examined, each sound measured against memory and anticipation. In this, they learned the duality of fascination and fear, a psychological training ground that would inform their understanding of the world long after the events of that morning. Among the elders and laborers, whispered speculation passed discreetly. They spoke in low tones of her insight, her presence, and the uncanny ability to foresee events and influence behavior without overt action. Each retelling carried weight, a mixture of reverence and unease. The air itself seemed charged, a subtle tension threading through conversations and movements alike. Even mundane tasks were approached with a careful mindfulness born of experience, the sense that life on the plantation had shifted under her influence and that order, perception, and expectation were now intertwined with her legacy, even before she had been seen that day. The mist gradually lifted as the sun climbed higher, casting light across the fields, revealing the meticulous care taken by those who worked there, and highlighting the quiet authority once exerted by her presence. Shadows shortened, yet the memory lingered, embedded in the movements, gestures, and expectations of everyone present. The air retained a tension, a subtle anticipation that suggested the extraordinary might unfold within the ordinary at any moment. The morning, though seemingly routine, carried the weight of past incidents and the unspoken acknowledgement of a presence that had altered reality in ways subtle but irrevocable. As the day progressed, attention shifted to the rhythms of labor, yet the undercurrent of awareness persisted. The enslaved woman, whose actions and presence had previously guided behavior, remained absent, yet her influence was felt in every measured step, every careful glance, and every unspoken calculation. It was a day like any other, yet imbued with an extraordinary sense of possibility, uncertainty, and psychological resonance. The plantation existed in a state of heightened perception, each individual attuned to the subtle traces left behind, as if the world itself remembered her and held its secrets close, waiting for someone perceptive enough to notice. The opening hours of this morning, captured in detail by memory and observation, established a tone of quiet suspense that would permeate the entire story. It introduced the themes of authority and awareness, perception and influence, fear and fascination, setting the stage for the unfolding narrative. Each participant, whether family, laborer, or child, was attuned to the delicate balance between ordinary routine and extraordinary presence. The plantation itself became a character, alive with echoes, shadows, and invisible forces that shaped the unfolding events, preparing the viewer for the layers of mystery, tension, and human complexity that would define the tale. The plantation stretched across the rolling Virginia landscape like a world apart, a meticulously cultivated stage where wealth, control, and silence coexisted under the oppressive sun. The manor house rose at the center of this domain, its white columns gleaming even in the fading light, an architectural assertion of order, refinement, and inherited power. Every detail of the house was designed to impress the eye and intimidate the spirit, polished floors that reflected the sunlight, windows carefully aligned to catch the morning light, gardens trimmed to geometric perfection. But beneath the pristine surface, the air vibrated with invisible tension, a network of human lives bound by coercion, fear, and obedience. Inside the house, the family moved with deliberate grace, their footsteps echoing in hallways lined with portraits of stern ancestors who seemed to judge the present from painted permanence. The patriarch, a man of rigid principles and unquestioned authority, maintained the plantation with exacting control. His wife, poised and reserved, navigated her role with the precision of someone trained to preserve appearances above all else. Yet even within the walls of power, cracks appeared, fleeting moments of doubt, glances that lingered too long, subtle expressions of unease. The veneer of civility could not fully mask the anxieties beneath. Beyond the columns, the enslaved population maintained the rhythms of labor with a precision dictated by survival. Fields of tobacco and corn stretched endlessly, their neat rows a testament to both human toil and the relentless oversight of the overseers. Sweat and soil, effort and exhaustion, became the unspoken language of existence. Each day began with the sun rising over the eastern hills and ended with its descent behind the western trees, marking the passage of time and labor, the quiet suffering hidden beneath routine. Every task was watched, every misstep punished, and yet within these constraints, patterns of resilience and subtle resistance emerged. Amid this balance of order and subjugation, the enslaved woman stood apart. Her movements were measured but confident, her presence quiet yet unmistakable. She understood the rhythms of the plantation, the unspoken hierarchies, and the delicate tension between obedience and survival. Her knowledge of the house and the fields went beyond practical necessity, it suggested a perception attuned to the undercurrents of human behavior. Those around her noticed an attentiveness that was almost unnatural, as though she saw what others overlooked and absorbed what others ignored. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her words carried weight disproportionate to their number. Even the overseers, trained to command and intimidate, felt an edge of caution in her silence. Daily life on the plantation was punctuated by subtle signals and rituals. The family relied on servants not only for physical labor but for maintaining appearances. Meals were served with precision, rooms cleaned and organized according to rigid expectations, and visitors received with the politeness demanded by social standing. The enslaved woman's presence in these moments, though often in the background, introduced a quiet tension. Her gaze lingered where it should not, her hands moved with a calm deliberation that drew attention without demanding it. To those who watched closely, it was as though she was constantly noting and recording, absorbing every detail of the world around her with an intent beyond the ordinary. Evenings brought a different kind of vigilance. Candles flickered in the manor's windows, casting long shadows that danced across the grounds. The air grew cooler, the sounds of the fields replaced by the low murmurs of life within the house. Here, the contrast between wealth and oppression became most apparent. The family reclined in comfort, discussing matters of trade, inheritance, or religion, while the enslaved prepared for the next day, tending to small personal tasks, speaking in hushed tones, and moving through the space with an almost invisible caution. The enslaved woman often lingered at the edges of these moments, observing the interactions, anticipating movements, her mind a quiet repository of everything that occurred. Her presence began to shape the subtle dynamics of the plantation. The children, curious and unrestrained, were drawn to her for reasons they could not articulate, sensing both wisdom and distance in her demeanor. The overseers, whose authority depended on clear obedience, felt an unspoken challenge in her calm resilience. Even the family, secure in wealth and position, occasionally paused, unsettled by a gaze or a comment that revealed an understanding they could not claim for themselves. The plantation, for all its symmetry and order, seemed to bend around her, a force both invisible and undeniable. At night, when the house was quiet and the fields were emptied of labor, the plantation assumed a different character. The white columns stood like silent sentinels in the moonlight, the wind carrying faint rustlings from the treetops, and the distant shadows of animals created a sense of movement that could never be fully accounted for. In this stillness, the enslaved woman's presence became more pronounced. Her movements through the house were careful and deliberate, her attention directed toward things unnoticed by others. She navigated hallways and rooms as if guided by an internal knowledge, aware of spaces that were off-limits, of corners where secrets might hide, and of moments where a word or gesture could alter perceptions. This section of the plantation's life establishes the dualities that define the narrative: appearance versus reality, power versus vulnerability, innocence versus cunning. The enslaved woman embodies these tensions, a figure of quiet authority in a world structured to suppress her agency. Every detail, from the polished floors to the hidden corridors, from the overseer's vigilance to the subtle gestures of the enslaved, contributes to a growing sense of unease and anticipation. Her presence refracts the plantation's rigid order, revealing the fragility beneath the surface and foreshadowing the mysteries that will soon engulf both the family and the laborers alike. The first signs of something unusual were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they spread through the plantation with a quiet persistence that could not be ignored. A misplaced tool here, a door left slightly ajar there, a fleeting shadow moving where no one should have been, small, fragmented events that might have been dismissed as forgetfulness or coincidence if repeated only once. But they multiplied, creating a pattern that the enslaved population noticed in hushed conversations under the cover of night. They exchanged glances when no one else was looking, their eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity, fear, and cautious awe. These moments began to weave themselves into the rhythm of the plantation, altering the perception of both the laborers and those in power. The enslaved woman, at the center of these occurrences, moved through the fields and hallways with a calm deliberation that drew attention without requiring explanation. Her hands lingered on objects for reasons no one could discern, her gaze followed trajectories that seemed invisible to others, and she often appeared in places that should have been impossible to reach unnoticed. Some of the workers began to whisper that she had knowledge beyond the ordinary, that she could anticipate events or sense intentions before they were voiced. These whispers spread slowly, first among those closest to her, then farther into the quarters, never reaching the ears of the family directly, yet carrying a tension that was almost tangible. Even the children began to notice the patterns. They described seeing her where she should not have been, or standing silently in the shadows as if listening to conversations not meant for her ears. Their recounting of events, though often fragmented, suggested a heightened perception, a sixth sense of sorts, that marked her as different in a way that was both fascinating and unsettling. The overseers, accustomed to control, felt an unspoken unease when she moved through the fields. Her presence challenged their authority in subtle ways. She required no words, no outward defiance, yet the effects were clear in the hesitations, the small mistakes, the sudden awareness of being observed. By day, these anomalies were more easily dismissed, swallowed by the rhythms of labor and routine. But at dusk, the plantation seemed to shift. Shadows lengthened across the rows of crops, the wind carried whispers that could not be fully explained, and the sounds of nocturnal animals punctuated an atmosphere thick with uncertainty. It was during these hours that the enslaved woman's peculiar attentiveness became most apparent. She paused in corners, observed movement in the fading light, and seemed to anticipate events before they happened. Her presence infused the plantation with a tension that could not be named but was deeply felt. The whispers themselves took on a life of their own. Stories of minor incidents, tools rearranged, animals behaving strangely, fleeting glimpses of figures in the trees, were shared cautiously among the laborers, forming a shared narrative of unease. Fear mingled with admiration. Some began to suspect that she possessed abilities beyond ordinary comprehension. Yet even as speculation grew, the enslaved population was careful. In a society structured around control and punishment, speaking too openly could be dangerous. These conversations existed in a liminal space, between rumor and observation, where truth was impossible to verify but too persistent to ignore. At the heart of these events was her intelligence and acute perception. She absorbed details unnoticed by others, memorized routes and behaviors, and seemed to predict interactions before they occurred. Her actions were measured, deliberate, yet never overtly confrontational. This created an enigmatic presence, a figure who moved within the strictures of the plantation yet remained untouchable in some essential way. Those who observed her felt the weight of her knowledge, the sense that she saw deeper than anyone else, and it provoked both anxiety and fascination. As days passed, the incidents became harder to explain. Objects shifted without cause, inexplicable sounds echoed through the empty rooms, and fleeting movements were noted by multiple witnesses. Even the plantation family, though distant from the fields and quarters, began to hear the rumors, their curiosity mingled with disbelief. Attempts to rationalize the phenomena with mundane explanations, wind, animals, forgetfulness, proved increasingly inadequate. Every occurrence seemed to defy ordinary logic, drawing attention back to her in subtle, undeniable ways. This period also marked a shift in the plantation's psychological landscape. Anxiety grew in the quarters, a mixture of respect and fear for the woman who seemed to inhabit a space between visibility and invisibility. The overseer's authority wavered in subtle moments, the family experienced small disruptions in the expected order of life, and the children's accounts of seeing her in impossible places added to the unease. Her quiet, deliberate presence began to shape the collective perception of reality on the plantation, a slow and inexorable redefinition of what could be explained and what could not. By the end of this period, it became clear that the anomalies were not random. Each incident connected to a larger, unseen pattern, one that defied easy comprehension. The enslaved woman had become a focal point for this growing tension, a figure whose actions and presence were both ordinary and extraordinary, grounded in reality yet bordering on the inexplicable. The plantation itself seemed to respond to her presence, the landscape of fields, halls, and shadows bending in subtle ways around her movements. What had begun as whispers among the oaks was evolving into a persistent, undeniable sense of mystery that would only deepen in the days to come. The first witnesses began to describe encounters that unsettled them in ways that reason could not easily account for. It started subtly, with fleeting impressions that something was amiss, overheard murmurs when no one appeared to speak, shadows stretching in directions inconsistent with light, and objects moved or altered in ways that defied explanation. These experiences were deeply disorienting, producing a sense of doubt in the minds of those who encountered them. Laborers spoke in low tones of glimpsing her in places she could not have been, of hearing her name whispered when the wind carried nothing, of noticing her presence before she arrived. Each account, though fragmentary, contributed to a growing tension that resonated through the quarters and fields alike. The enslaved woman, whose quiet attentiveness had already drawn notice, became increasingly central to these inexplicable occurrences. Witnesses described the feeling of being observed when no one was watching, of her gaze lingering even in her absence, a presence both invisible and inescapable. Her knowledge of the plantation's rhythms and routines seemed uncanny, her movements synchronized with events before they could unfold. Children spoke of catching glimpses of her in the hallways or corridors of the manor during moments when she was supposed to be elsewhere, their fear mingled with a fascination that made them reluctant to speak openly. The overseers, trained to command and intimidate, began to experience an unspoken unease, aware that her awareness surpassed their expectations. As the phenomena escalated, the accounts became more concrete yet no less unsettling. A servant described returning from the fields to find an object she had been carrying now placed neatly on a table, despite no one having touched it. Another spoke of hearing footsteps behind them in a hall that was otherwise empty, only to find her standing silently at a window, as if aware of every movement. These moments were accompanied by sensations that could not be described fully: chill winds in the middle of summer, a sense of being watched from angles that should have been impossible, and the fleeting impression of a presence that could not be identified. Such experiences deepened the growing perception that she was unlike anyone else on the plantation, a figure simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. The family began to hear fragments of these reports. Their initial skepticism clashed with an uneasy awareness that something had shifted within the boundaries of their carefully maintained world. The patriarch, a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of life around him, found himself unsettled by descriptions of her behavior and the persistent rumors among his children and servants. The matriarch observed subtle inconsistencies in the household, unexplained movements or changes that no one could account for, and began to question whether the apparent order she maintained concealed forces beyond comprehension. Each encounter introduced a tension between the known and the unknown, challenging their assumptions of control and authority. Attempts to confront or rationalize the phenomena often failed spectacularly. Overseers would approach her with direct questions, expecting resistance or defiance, only to find her responses measured, almost indifferent. She would remain composed, observing without revealing the source of her awareness. When questioned about missing objects or unexplained sounds, her calm demeanor did not falter, and her explanations were minimal yet precise, raising more questions than they resolved. The tension between observation and explanation, between the visible and the invisible, created a growing unease that spread like an invisible fog across the plantation. Children's accounts added another layer of complexity. They described moments in the evening when they believed they saw her interacting with shadows or whispering to figures no one else could see. Their stories were fragmented, often contradictory, yet carried a consistency in the emotional impact they conveyed: fear, awe, and a sense that ordinary rules of space and time did not fully apply. Their observations, dismissed by some adults as fantasy, became harder to ignore as multiple children reported similar experiences independently. The repetition lent credence to the sense that something inexplicable was unfolding around her presence. The enslaved population, deeply attuned to subtle patterns of behavior, began to recognize that her influence extended beyond mere observation. She seemed to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to act in ways that preempted conflict or misfortune. This attentiveness, once admired quietly, now began to produce fear for some. They felt as if their thoughts and intentions were no longer private, as though she could perceive the internal movements of mind and spirit without effort. Rumors spread cautiously, never fully voiced in front of outsiders, yet their impact on the social and psychological fabric of the plantation was undeniable. In these months, the plantation itself seemed transformed. The air, once thick with routine labor and obedience, grew taut with anticipation, the boundaries between night and day, between seen and unseen, increasingly blurred. Every hallway, corridor, and field became a potential locus of her observation. Shadows elongated, small noises took on disproportionate significance, and every glance seemed freighted with meaning. Those who had once moved freely within these spaces now did so with heightened awareness, their attention divided between their duties and an inexplicable vigilance. Even the most disciplined laborers found themselves unsettled, their confidence eroded by the persistence of incidents they could not rationalize. The culmination of these experiences marked a turning point in the plantation's collective consciousness. The enslaved woman, through her quiet and deliberate presence, had become a nexus of mystery. Witnesses who could articulate their experiences struggled to reconcile them with known reality, and those who could not speak openly were left to internalize a persistent unease. Her influence extended beyond immediate observation, it reshaped perceptions, altered behavior, and introduced a pervasive tension that would come to define life on the plantation. The stage was set for further escalation, as curiosity, fear, and fascination collided in ways that would challenge the limits of understanding and control. As the incidents surrounding her presence grew more pronounced, the plantation's attention turned toward frameworks that could impose meaning on the inexplicable. Religious belief, which had long underpinned the daily routines and social hierarchy, became the primary lens through which people attempted to understand her actions. Ministers and devout family members insisted that divine intervention or demonic influence must be at work, interpreting her knowledge and behavior as signs from forces beyond human comprehension. Sermons began to emphasize vigilance, morality, and the danger of unseen spirits, weaving a subtle atmosphere of fear and control that resonated through both the house and the quarters. Even those not particularly devout felt a shift in the moral texture of the plantation, as the discourse around her abilities introduced an implicit question of righteousness and spiritual alignment. The enslaved population, already cautious in their discussions, approached these interpretations with a complex mixture of reverence and fear. Some accepted the spiritual framing as a way to rationalize what could not otherwise be explained, attributing her actions to divine favor or supernatural knowledge. Others, more skeptical but no less fearful, treated her abilities as signs that she occupied a liminal space between the human and the unknown. Conversations took place in whispers beneath trees, in corners shielded from overseers' eyes, with stories and rumors circulating that emphasized both her intelligence and the eerie nature of her presence. Each retelling added layers to the collective myth, blending fact and interpretation into a narrative that was almost impossible to untangle. Within the family, responses varied sharply. The patriarch, whose authority depended on predictable order, alternated between anger and unease, resisting the notion that spiritual forces could disrupt the hierarchy he controlled. He attempted to enforce explanations grounded in discipline and rationality, seeking to reduce the incidents to mischief or imagination. The matriarch, observing the growing strain on both family and servants, leaned more heavily on religious interpretation, urging prayer, reflection, and ritual observances intended to contain what could not otherwise be managed. Their interactions underscored the tension between reason and faith, authority and vulnerability, revealing the fragility of control when faced with persistent, unexplained phenomena. Attempts to discipline or confront her directly were often met with subtle resistance. She moved within her bounds without overt defiance, adhering to the expectations of obedience while simultaneously challenging the plantation's assumptions. Her calm composure during confrontations, her ability to anticipate responses, and her precise, measured words added to the sense that she could not be fully categorized or controlled. This delicate balance heightened the unease, demonstrating that neither punishment nor admonition could fully account for or mitigate her presence. Those who sought to dominate her felt their efforts undermined not by action but by perception, as she remained quietly inscrutable. At the same time, the religious framework itself began to falter under the weight of repeated anomalies. Incidents that could not be easily attributed to divine favor or demonic interference challenged the explanatory power of sermons and moral guidance. Even ministers, faced with detailed accounts of her inexplicable knowledge and subtle influence, found themselves unsettled, acknowledging privately that they could not fully account for the pattern of events. This acknowledgement rarely surfaced publicly, yet it contributed to a pervasive tension, a sense that the familiar tools of faith and authority were insufficient against the subtle intelligence and awareness she exhibited. Among the enslaved, the tension between acceptance and fear grew more pronounced. Some began to view her as a protective figure, someone whose presence provided subtle guidance and insight into the dangers of plantation life. Others feared that her influence drew the attention of powers beyond human reckoning, that curiosity or misinterpretation could invite harm. This dual perception created a social complexity within the quarters, a network of respect, wariness, and cautious admiration that underscored the psychological impact of her presence. Her actions, though rarely overtly visible, reverberated through the collective consciousness, shaping behavior and expectation in ways that could not be easily reversed. The children, exposed to both family and servant interpretations, wrestled with the tension between instruction, belief, and observation. They were instructed to fear and respect the unknown, to remain obedient and cautious, and yet their own experiences often contradicted these teachings. The juxtaposition of curiosity and imposed faith intensified the psychological atmosphere, heightening the sense of mystery surrounding her. Every interaction, every observation, became a potential moment of revelation or disruption, further destabilizing the plantation's sense of predictable order. In this period, the plantation itself seemed caught between worlds. Days proceeded with labor and obligation, yet the moral and spiritual discourse created an additional layer of unease. Every sound, shadow, and subtle gesture was interpreted through multiple lenses, the practical, the spiritual, and the psychological. The enslaved woman moved through these overlapping frameworks with an uncanny equilibrium, responding when necessary but rarely yielding insight. Her quiet command of presence, coupled with the failure of both faith and authority to fully contain her influence, intensified the tension across the plantation, setting the stage for escalating psychological strain and deeper mysteries to come. The psychological weight of the plantation grew heavier with each passing day, settling into the hearts and minds of all who lived there. Anxiety spread like a slow, invisible contagion, threading through the laborers, overseers, and family alike, leaving an almost tangible tension that clung to every corridor, hallway, and field. Sleep became elusive, dreams were haunted by fleeting shadows, whispers, and the sense of eyes following movements even when the plantation appeared empty. For some, the mind began to fracture under the pressure of constant vigilance and the subtle disturbances that could not be explained, their perception of reality bending under a weight that seemed both external and internal. The enslaved woman's quiet attentiveness became an omnipresent force in this atmosphere. Her measured movements, the precision of her actions, and the depth of her awareness exerted a silent authority that undermined confidence and control. Overseers found themselves hesitating before giving orders, doubting what they had seen or heard. Laborers began second-guessing their steps, unsure whether missteps were accidents or influenced by unseen observation. Even the children noticed small inconsistencies, a shifted object, a sound carried differently by the wind, a shadow that did not align with the sun. Each event accumulated, layering a subtle but persistent unease upon all who inhabited the plantation grounds. The incidents themselves escalated in intensity and variety. Animals behaved strangely, abandoning familiar routines or reacting violently to unseen presences. Tools and objects shifted inexplicably, often appearing in places that suggested deliberate movement by invisible hands. Whispers and fleeting sounds haunted hallways at night, growing more insistent with every telling. The enslaved woman's behavior remained calm, almost indifferent to the disruptions, but her awareness of them, her ability to move through the plantation without alerting anyone to her knowledge, amplified the psychological strain for those who witnessed or heard of these occurrences. Her presence became a quiet but undeniable catalyst for fear and fascination. As days bled into weeks, the strain on the family became increasingly apparent. The patriarch, accustomed to exercising control over every aspect of life on the plantation, felt a growing erosion of authority. Small, unexplained events undermined his certainty, introducing doubt into decisions that had once been absolute. The matriarch, while outwardly composed, experienced a constant tension between rational explanation and the unsettling reports she received from servants and children alike. Their combined anxiety created an atmosphere thick with unspoken questions, a persistent uncertainty that spread through every interaction, conversation, and observation. Among the enslaved population, the psychological effect was profound. Individuals became hyper-aware of their surroundings, constantly monitoring for both natural and unnatural occurrences. Conversations were measured, gestures calculated, and movement deliberate, each person adjusting behavior to account for the possibility of unseen observation or intervention. Respect and fear for the enslaved woman grew in equal measure. She was a figure whose awareness was both protective and disquieting, a constant presence whose knowledge seemed to extend beyond ordinary human perception. The mental toll of living under her quiet scrutiny created a fragile balance of admiration, awe, and apprehension. Children, especially sensitive to inconsistencies in routine and perception, were caught between fascination and fear. They noticed how adults' behavior changed in her presence, how small disturbances in the environment could provoke disproportionate reactions, and how the plantation's usual rhythm seemed subtly altered when she moved among them. Their understanding of cause and effect began to blur, and imagination and observation merged in ways that produced genuine anxiety. Yet, their curiosity was impossible to suppress. They watched, questioned, and noted details with a precision born of both fear and wonder. The cumulative effect of these pressures was a palpable fracturing of the collective psyche. Hallways seemed longer, shadows darker, and every rustle or whisper charged with potential significance. Even those who did not directly witness her actions felt their influence indirectly, through the reactions of others, through repeated stories, and through the heightened sense of vigilance that pervaded the plantation. The enslaved woman, by maintaining her quiet, deliberate awareness, became both the focal point and the agent of this psychological strain, shaping perception without overtly acting to dominate or manipulate. As tensions mounted, the plantation existed in a constant state of near collapse, a world teetering on the edge of order and chaos. The minds of those within it were stretched to their limits, trying to reconcile daily routines with events that defied explanation. Every interaction, glance, and whisper carried amplified significance, creating a delicate lattice of fear, curiosity, and awe. The subtle but relentless pressure imposed by her presence made it clear that life on the plantation had shifted irrevocably, and that the ordinary boundaries of control, reason, and perception could no longer contain the unfolding mystery. The tension that had been quietly building across the plantation reached a critical point as the patriarch, driven by both authority and frustration, decided to confront the enslaved woman directly. The confrontation was not sudden but carefully orchestrated, an event intended to assert control and demand explanation. He summoned her to the parlor, a space dominated by polished floors and heavy draperies, the air thick with the scents of candle wax and aged wood. Servants were discreetly stationed nearby, and the family gathered silently, their expressions a mix of apprehension and expectation. The atmosphere was taut with unspoken questions, every footstep and gesture laden with significance. When she entered the room, she moved with her usual calm precision, her eyes alert but measured, taking in the details of the space, the people present, and the tension that radiated from every corner. The patriarch's voice, at first controlled and firm, attempted to elicit an explanation for the disturbances that had unsettled the plantation. Objects shifted mysteriously, whispers carried through empty corridors, and her uncanny awareness had challenged his authority. Each word he spoke was calculated, seeking to probe the boundaries of her understanding, to draw from her a rational explanation or a confession of some deliberate mischief. Her responses, however, were measured and minimal, revealing no hint of deception yet offering no clear answers. She acknowledged events with a quiet composure that neither confirmed nor denied their reality. Her gaze, steady and unflinching, seemed to perceive both the spoken and unspoken elements of the room, as if she could read intentions before they were articulated. This created a subtle but powerful reversal of control. The patriarch, accustomed to commanding obedience, found himself negotiating an invisible authority, responding to a presence that existed beyond the ordinary structures of power he understood. As the confrontation continued, the family's children observed from nearby, their curiosity mingled with a deepening unease. They noted the precision of her movements, the stillness of her stance, and the way she appeared to absorb every detail without faltering. Their observations heightened the sense of tension, underscoring the contrast between her composed mastery and the patriarch's mounting frustration. Even the overseers, usually confident in their ability to enforce order, sensed a subtle challenge in her demeanor, a quiet awareness that rendered their authority ineffective. In the following days, attempts to rationalize or explain her behavior intensified. Scholars and local doctors were consulted, summoned under the pretense of providing scientific or medical explanations for the unexplainable events. They examined her carefully, observing her routines, asking questions, and noting patterns that seemed at once ordinary and extraordinary. None could reconcile the precision of her awareness, the timing of her actions, or the subtle influence she exerted over her surroundings. The more they studied, the less conclusive their findings became, reinforcing the sense that she existed at the margins of ordinary comprehension. Within the quarters, whispers of the confrontation spread quickly. The enslaved population, careful to maintain discretion, shared fragmented accounts of what had occurred, emphasizing her composure, intelligence, and uncanny perception. These stories grew into a shared narrative, blending observation, speculation, and subtle myth-making. Her presence, once quietly influential, became more pronounced as the mystery deepened, drawing both admiration and apprehension from those who observed her. Every retelling reinforced the sense that she was a figure both central and untouchable, whose knowledge and awareness transcended the expected boundaries of her position. The cumulative effect of these events was a heightened awareness across the plantation. Every task, interaction, and movement became an occasion for observation and interpretation. The patriarch's attempts to assert authority had paradoxically amplified her influence, illustrating the limits of control when faced with a presence that defied conventional understanding. The tension between curiosity and confrontation created an atmosphere thick with anticipation, where ordinary routines were infused with the weight of possibility and the threat of disruption. Even the children, whose natural curiosity was sharpened by the events, began to understand that the boundaries of their world were shifting. Shadows and whispers, once peripheral, were now central to the plantation's social and psychological landscape. The enslaved woman's ability to anticipate, observe, and respond to the smallest details created a persistent undercurrent of unease, a sense that life on the plantation had been subtly, irreversibly transformed. Each encounter, each subtle action, added to a growing tapestry of uncertainty that defied explanation and ensured that her presence would remain a focus of both fear and fascination for years to come. The confrontation thus became a pivotal moment, not for resolution but for escalation. It revealed the inadequacy of authority, the insufficiency of observation alone, and the complexity of human perception when confronted with an intelligence that operated quietly but effectively within the same space. The interplay of curiosity, challenge, and restrained revelation marked a turning point, intensifying the mystery and ensuring that both the family and the laborers were irrevocably drawn into the orbit of her influence, unable to fully define, contain, or dismiss the force she represented. It was during one oppressive summer when the plantation seemed to hold its breath that the enslaved woman disappeared entirely. One morning, she was simply gone, leaving behind the quiet echo of her presence in every corridor, field, and shadowed corner. At first, those who had come to rely on the subtle guidance and awareness she provided assumed she had slipped quietly to some necessary task or walked into the woods beyond the property. But hours turned into a day, and the realization that she had vanished without explanation settled over the plantation like a heavy fog, chilling the hearts of both laborers and family alike. The initial response was practical. Overseers and laborers scoured the fields, calling her name through the rows of tobacco and corn. They searched hidden nooks in the manor house, storage rooms, and kitchens, yet no trace of her could be found. The patriarch became increasingly agitated, the veneer of control cracking as every inquiry produced silence. The matriarch, while outwardly composed, felt the growing tension of unanswered questions pressing against her chest, the familiar rhythms of household management disrupted by an absence that could not be rationalized. Her disappearance unsettled the delicate balance that had existed between order and quiet apprehension, revealing just how central her presence had been to the plantation's unspoken structure. As the hours stretched into days, whispers began to circulate through the quarters. Stories of her movements, previously observed with fascination or fear, were now tinged with anxiety. Some spoke of glimpses of her at the edge of the woods or through the trees, moments when she appeared just long enough to vanish again into shadow. Others claimed that her absence was accompanied by a sense of her attention lingering in spaces she had occupied, an invisible force that seemed to watch over or through those who remained. These tales, shared cautiously and in whispers, infused the plantation with a growing tension that bordered on superstition. The children, particularly sensitive to both the absence and the lingering aura of her presence, became restless and unsettled. They described feeling her eyes in empty rooms, hearing faint footsteps echoing along corridors when no one was near. Their stories, often fragmented and contradictory, carried a remarkable consistency and emotional intensity, a mixture of awe, fear, and longing. Even the adults, trained to dismiss such accounts as childish imagination, found themselves unnerved by details that matched their own subtle experiences, objects slightly displaced, unexplained breezes, shadows falling in ways inconsistent with the light. The enslaved population, who had come to depend upon her guidance and quiet intelligence, felt the full weight of her absence. Daily routines were disrupted. Tasks previously navigated with a subtle shared understanding became fraught with uncertainty. The laborers, once able to rely on her awareness to anticipate the movements of overseers or to avoid conflict, now moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the fields and halls for signs that she might return. Fear, previously mingled with respect, now dominated interactions, as the absence of her stabilizing presence created a fragile atmosphere where mistakes, missteps, or misinterpretations could carry consequence. Attempts to rationalize her disappearance proved futile. The patriarch insisted she had merely walked beyond the boundaries of the property, yet the precision and knowledge she had displayed suggested otherwise. Overseers suggested she had hidden or was playing a trick, but the calm deliberation with which she had always moved made deception seem unlikely. Scholars consulted for explanations offered tentative theories of distraction or purposeful evasion, but each hypothesis failed to account for the depth of her influence and the certainty with which she had previously acted. Her absence became as inexplicable as her presence had been compelling. In the evenings, the plantation felt transformed. Shadows lengthened into corridors and fields, stretching as though to fill the space left by her absence. Even familiar routines, the gathering of tools, the closing of doors, the rounding of livestock, took on a tentative quality. The collective consciousness of the plantation, shaped and influenced by her subtle authority, was left unmoored. Individuals felt that they were no longer operating within fully understood parameters, as though an invisible anchor had been removed. The sense of being watched, once tangible and direct, now persisted as an intangible echo, haunting both quarters and hallways alike. Over time, stories of her sudden appearances and vanishings became part of the plantation's folklore. Witnesses recounted glimpses in peripheral vision, fleeting shadows moving among trees, and a quiet awareness that suggested she had not truly left, but existed on the threshold of perception. These accounts were whispered cautiously, never formalized, yet they carried the emotional weight of repeated experiences. The plantation, in her absence, seemed to orbit around a central emptiness, aware that something essential had departed yet unable to articulate the full significance of its loss. Her disappearance marked a turning point not only in the physical routines of the plantation but in the collective psyche of those who lived there. Fear, curiosity, and awe intertwined, producing a heightened sensitivity to environment and behavior. The vanishing underscored the limits of control, the fragility of routine, and the impact of an individual whose quiet awareness had shaped the very perception of reality around her. Each passing day without her presence deepened the sense that the plantation had crossed into a space between known and unknown, a world balanced precariously on the edge of comprehension. In the months that followed her disappearance, the plantation settled into a fragile, uneasy routine. Life continued outwardly as before, with crops tended, meals prepared, and daily labor performed, yet an invisible tension lingered in every corner. Her absence left a void that could not be measured in physical terms alone. It was a silence heavy with memory, an unspoken presence that pervaded both quarters and hallways. The laborers moved with caution, aware that the subtle guidance and quiet authority she had once offered were no longer there, leaving them to navigate uncertainties alone. Even the simplest tasks were shadowed by recollection, a memory of her attentiveness that suggested both safety and scrutiny. The family, too, felt the effects of her absence in ways that went beyond inconvenience. The patriarch's authority, already strained by repeated anomalies and confrontations, seemed diminished in its capacity to influence perception and behavior. The matriarch observed small, inexplicable changes, objects slightly displaced, children hesitating in rooms she had once moved through with purpose, and a quiet unease among the servants that could not be dismissed. Their control over the plantation, which had been exercised through both overt authority and the subtle management of routine, now felt incomplete. The silence she left behind created a space where uncertainty flourished, a psychological residue that no decree or sermon could dispel. Stories of her presence became legend, passed carefully from one generation of laborers to the next. In hushed tones beneath the oaks and behind closed doors, they spoke of her knowledge, her movements, and the sense that she existed simultaneously in the seen and unseen world. These stories were shaped by memory and speculation, blending fact with interpretation, yet they carried a truth of emotional resonance. She had altered the very perception of life on the plantation. To speak of her was to acknowledge a presence that had once commanded respect, fear, and fascination, and whose absence left a persistent ache of incompletion. The children, who had witnessed her directly, retained vivid recollections that shaped their understanding of authority, perception, and the boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary experience. They described her movements with detail that impressed even the adults, noting gestures, expressions, and subtle actions that conveyed awareness far beyond what seemed possible. These recollections became a secret repository of knowledge, a lens through which they interpreted both behavior and the physical environment. In time, their retelling formed the foundation of the stories that would endure beyond the immediate memory of those who had lived through the events. Among the enslaved population, her legacy manifested in both caution and reverence. They adapted their behaviors to account for the possibility that her awareness, though physically absent, continued to exert influence. Fields were tended with a meticulous attention to detail, conversations measured for subtle cues, and patterns of interaction shaped by a lingering sense of observation. Even those who had been skeptical came to recognize the weight of her influence, acknowledging quietly that her presence, whether remembered, imagined, or actual, had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the plantation. The silence she left was as impactful as any act she had performed, a testament to the enduring power of presence beyond visible action. The family's relationship to this legacy was more complex. The patriarch struggled privately with the realization that control, authority, and observation were insufficient to account for the phenomena he had witnessed. The matriarch, reflecting on the changes in household dynamics, recognized that fear and respect, when combined with mystery, created a form of influence that no command could replicate. Their understanding of hierarchy and discipline had been challenged by someone whom they had attempted to categorize and constrain, yet could not fully comprehend. This acknowledgement, unspoken but deeply felt, reinforced the persistence of her legacy in ways that were both subtle and profound. Over time, the plantation itself seemed to bear traces of her influence. Hallways, rooms, and corners retained the memory of her attentiveness, fields carried the echo of her movements. Even as labor and social order continued, there was a persistent awareness among those who remained that the world had shifted in subtle, irrevocable ways. The stories told, the habits observed, and the shared sense of caution created a social and psychological framework shaped in part by her memory. It was a presence that could not be measured by time alone, for it persisted in perception, action, and narrative. The enduring silence she left behind was not empty but charged with meaning. It spoke of limits, of what could be controlled, comprehended, or rationalized, and of the subtle power inherent in knowledge, observation, and quiet defiance. Her influence, once active and tangible, became a quiet force embedded in memory, behavior, and collective consciousness. The plantation continued its routines, yet beneath the surface, her presence lingered, a shadow of authority, awareness, and mystery that could neither be erased nor fully understood. In this period, the psychological and social effects of her absence crystallized into a complex legacy. Fear, respect, fascination, and caution intertwined, shaping behavior and perception in ways that extended far beyond her physical presence. Her story, preserved in memory, whispered accounts, and subtle adaptations of daily life, became an enduring testament to the impact of one individual on a tightly controlled world. The plantation, though outwardly ordinary, remained forever marked by the invisible weight of her influence, a presence felt in silence yet impossible to forget. As years passed, the events surrounding the enslaved woman evolved into a series of enduring questions that no one could fully resolve. Scholars, historians, and local residents debated her presence, abilities, and disappearance, yet each theory seemed to illuminate one facet while leaving others shrouded in uncertainty. Some insisted she possessed an almost supernatural perception, a combination of intelligence and intuition so acute that it bordered on preternatural. Others argued that her knowledge was practical, honed through observation, memory, and a deep understanding of human behavior, yet even this rational explanation failed to account for the precision and timing that had unsettled overseers, laborers, and family alike. Every hypothesis seemed incomplete, leaving gaps filled by speculation, awe, and lingering fear. The plantation itself became a site of quiet legend. Visitors occasionally asked about the stories they had heard, and residents shared fragmentary accounts, careful to preserve both fact and discretion. Each retelling varied slightly, shaped by memory, interpretation, and the natural tendency of stories to evolve over time. Yet a consistent theme persisted, the sense that she had altered the very perception of reality within the plantation, leaving behind a legacy that continued to influence behavior, expectation, and belief. Those who had witnessed her directly struggled to reconcile their memories with a world that had moved forward, aware that the extraordinary had occurred within the ordinary confines of fields, halls, and rooms. Local folklore began to intertwine with historical accounts, producing narratives that were both haunting and instructive. Some villagers claimed that she appeared at night, glimpsed at the edge of fields or wandering the pathways beyond the house. Others insisted that her presence lingered in intangible ways, a sudden awareness of being observed, the sense that routine events carried hidden meaning, or fleeting impressions of shadows moving where no one should be. These accounts were never consistent in detail, yet they all shared a common emotional resonance, a mixture of awe, fear, and recognition of her subtle power. Her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of human limitation in the face of intelligence, perception, and agency that defied categorization. Debates within the family, too, continued long after her disappearance. Descendants recounted anecdotes of unusual awareness, the uncanny timing of her actions, and the ways in which ordinary authority had faltered in her presence. These discussions were tinged with frustration, curiosity, and admiration, as each new generation attempted to reconcile the practical realities of plantation life with the inexplicable events that had defined a period of their history. The patriarchs' and matriarchs' descendants found themselves haunted not only by the memory of her intelligence but by the enduring uncertainty surrounding her motivations and the mechanisms of her perception. Attempts at scientific or rational explanation persisted into later generations. Observers noted patterns that suggested extraordinary observational skills, a mastery of timing, and a psychological acuity that allowed her to anticipate behavior and circumstance. Yet even modern analysis struggled to account for all aspects of her influence. Small details, once dismissed or overlooked, seemed significant when viewed in aggregate: the consistency of her awareness, the subtle psychological impact on those around her, and the lingering effects on the plantation's social and operational structure. Rational theory could explain some aspects, but gaps remained that could not be resolved without resorting to speculation or acknowledgement of the limits of human understanding. The narrative also explored the interplay between fear, admiration, and mystery. Those who had worked closely with her described the emotional complexity of her presence, a mixture of respect for her intelligence, anxiety over her awareness, and fascination with her deliberate calm. These emotions, experienced collectively, created a psychological environment in which perception and memory reinforced each other. The plantation, once structured by authority and routine, had been subtly reshaped by her presence, leaving an enduring imprint on both the physical environment and the human consciousness within it. Even as her physical presence faded into history, her influence persisted in subtle ways. Practices, habits, and unwritten rules adapted by the enslaved population reflected the awareness and caution cultivated under her gaze. Stories told to children emphasized attentiveness, perception, and respect for intelligence that could not be contained by conventional power structures. The memory of her abilities became a guiding force, shaping behavior and expectation, and providing a framework for understanding both human interaction and the limits of control in a world dominated by hierarchy and labor. The lingering questions extended beyond the practical and psychological into the philosophical. What accounted for her abilities? Were they the result of heightened observation, innate intelligence, or a perception that transcended ordinary understanding? Did her presence challenge the social order intentionally, or was it simply a byproduct of her awareness and adaptability? Each answer seemed provisional, revealing some truths while leaving others obscured. The uncertainty, rather than diminishing her impact, magnified it, transforming her story into a narrative both haunting and instructive. Ultimately, her tale became emblematic of the unknowable elements within structured society. It highlighted the tension between authority and agency, observation and understanding, routine and disruption. The plantation, while continuing its outward operations, remained psychically altered by the events she had shaped. Her story endured in memory, folklore, and subtle behaviors, leaving questions without answers and ensuring that the extraordinary had permanently inscribed itself upon the ordinary. Generations later, the plantation and its surrounding lands carried the invisible imprint of her presence, a resonance that persisted long after memory had blurred and records had faded. Descendants of both the family and the enslaved population spoke cautiously of the stories they had inherited, aware that repetition could solidify legend while obscuring fact. Yet the accounts, passed in hushed tones beneath trees or around fires, maintained a haunting clarity, emphasizing not only her extraordinary awareness but the subtle ways she had reshaped human perception and behavior. The plantation, though outwardly ordinary, existed as a vessel for this lingering influence, each hallway, field, and shadow a silent testament to the invisible thread she had woven. Visitors and historians who arrived decades later were struck by the consistency of the tales, their details surprisingly precise despite the passage of time. Locals spoke of fleeting glimpses, odd coincidences, and a sense of attention lingering in empty spaces, as though the plantation itself remembered her. These stories were not uniform, varying in specifics, yet all conveyed a similar emotional resonance: awe, fear, respect, and a recognition that ordinary understanding could not fully account for her presence. The repetition of these accounts reinforced the sense that her influence extended beyond the temporal boundaries of her life, shaping both memory and environment in subtle but enduring ways. In private conversations, descendants of the original family reflected on the psychological and social ramifications of her presence. They acknowledged that their ancestors had been confronted with a level of intelligence and perception that challenged conventional authority, introducing uncertainty into the structures of control that had defined the plantation. These reflections were tinged with both admiration and frustration, the recognition that one individual could wield a quiet power through observation, awareness, and deliberate action, leaving a permanent imprint on the social order. Her story became a lens through which the limits of human understanding and the subtle dynamics of influence could be examined. Among the enslaved community and their descendants, her legacy manifested in both practical and symbolic ways. Knowledge of her attentiveness and insight became a teaching tool, passed quietly to guide behavior, anticipate challenges, and navigate social hierarchies. These lessons emphasized observation, patience, and the subtle exertion of influence without confrontation, qualities she had demonstrated throughout her life. Her memory acted as both an anchor and a guide, shaping patterns of thought, action, and community cohesion in ways that reinforced her enduring presence even in absence. The plantation itself seemed imbued with traces of her subtle intelligence. Hallways, courtyards, and fields retained the echo of her movements, the memory of her attentiveness shaping how laborers navigated space and time. Even the natural world seemed to respond, in anecdotal accounts, with inexplicable patterns of animal behavior or sudden changes in wind and light that coincided with her presence. Whether interpreted as folklore, psychological projection, or an actual lingering influence, these accounts reinforced the perception that she had left an indelible mark on both environment and consciousness. Stories of her perceptiveness and mysterious disappearance inspired curiosity beyond the immediate community. Scholars, folklorists, and visitors sought to reconstruct her life and actions, yet every effort revealed gaps in knowledge and understanding. The interplay between fact, memory, and legend created a tapestry of interpretation, one in which her precise abilities could be inferred but never fully confirmed. Each retelling highlighted both the limits of human perception and the extraordinary impact of her quiet awareness, ensuring that her story would remain an unresolved mystery for all who encountered it. Over time, her narrative became emblematic of broader themes: the tension between observation and authority, the fragility of control, and the capacity for one individual to shape collective perception without overt domination. These themes resonated across generations, informing the ways people thought about power, influence, and the nature of intelligence. The plantation, as a physical and symbolic space, served as a canvas upon which these dynamics were imprinted, its legacy intertwined with the memory of her subtle, yet undeniable, presence. Even as historical records attempted to formalize events, the human element, the whispers, the fleeting glimpses, the emotional resonance, resisted codification. The plantation's descendants acknowledged that understanding her fully was impossible. She existed at the threshold of perception, a figure both grounded in reality and hovering at the edge of legend. The persistence of these stories reinforced a central truth, that some forces cannot be neatly categorized or controlled, and that extraordinary perception can leave echoes that endure far beyond a single lifetime. Her legacy, therefore, became an enduring lesson in human perception, influence, and the unknown. It emphasized the subtle power inherent in observation, the capacity to shape behavior without overt action, and the persistence of memory across time. The plantation, its inhabitants, and their descendants continued to navigate the echoes of her presence, aware that they were living within a reality subtly altered by one individual's quiet intelligence, deliberate action, and enduring mystery. In the final reckoning, the plantation existed as both a historical site and a psychological landscape, marked indelibly by her influence. Her story persisted not merely in memory or record, but in the behaviors, habits, and subtle consciousness of those who lived and moved within its bounds. The extraordinary had passed into legend, yet it retained a palpable, enduring impact, a testament to a presence that could not be forgotten, measured, or fully explained. Even decades later, the story of the enslaved woman persisted as a haunting enigma, a thread woven into the memory of the land and the people who had once lived on the plantation. Visitors walking the halls or traversing the fields often reported a strange awareness, a subtle feeling of being observed, as though her presence still lingered invisibly. These impressions were fleeting yet persistent, shaping perception in ways that could not be fully articulated or explained. The boundaries between history and memory, observation and imagination, seemed to blur, leaving a haunting resonance that defied conventional explanation. Descendants of both the family and the enslaved population spoke of her in careful, almost reverent tones. They described the stories passed down across generations, stories that emphasized not only her intelligence and awareness but the subtle power she had exerted over behavior, attention, and perception. Each retelling carried an emotional weight, a mixture of awe, fear, and wonder that reinforced the sense that she had permanently altered the landscape of both human interaction and the physical space she had inhabited. The persistence of these narratives ensured that her influence endured, quietly shaping expectation and behavior in ways that were often invisible but deeply felt. Scholars, historians, and local storytellers continued to debate the nature of her abilities and the circumstances of her disappearance. Some theorized that she possessed an extraordinary perceptual acuity, perhaps the result of innate intelligence or an exceptional ability to read human behavior. Others entertained the possibility of something beyond ordinary comprehension, a phenomenon that hovered between explanation and myth. Every attempt to categorize or rationalize her presence encountered limitations, leaving a profound sense of uncertainty. The unresolved nature of her story became central to its enduring power, a reminder of the limits of human understanding and the persistence of mystery. The plantation itself seemed imbued with traces of her presence, a subtle awareness that persisted in memory and environment alike. Rooms, hallways, and courtyards carried echoes of her attentiveness, fields retained patterns of behavior influenced by her observation. Even natural phenomena, the movement of animals, the rustle of wind through the trees, were occasionally interpreted as signs of lingering influence. These interpretations, whether grounded in reality, perception, or legend, reinforced the sense that she had not fully departed, that her consciousness had left an indelible mark that transcended temporal and physical boundaries. Among the descendants of the enslaved, her legacy informed both practical and symbolic behaviors. Stories of her attentiveness, foresight, and subtle guidance became tools for teaching, caution, and strategy. Children were instructed to observe carefully, anticipate consequences, and respect knowledge and intelligence wherever it appeared. In this way, her influence persisted, shaping social dynamics, habits, and the ways in which individuals navigated both everyday life and the complexities of human interaction. Her story served as a quiet guide, a template for behavior that emphasized awareness, patience, and subtle influence rather than confrontation or dominance. The emotional resonance of her presence endured alongside the practical lessons she left behind. Fear, awe, admiration, and respect intertwined in the memories and stories passed down, producing a psychological landscape in which her impact remained tangible. The plantation's physical and social environment had been forever shaped by her quiet intelligence and deliberate action, and even in her absence, the tension between ordinary life and extraordinary perception persisted. Individuals moving within the space sensed the weight of her legacy, experiencing moments of reflection, caution, or curiosity triggered by subtle cues in their surroundings. Historians attempting to reconstruct events faced the dual challenge of separating fact from legend while acknowledging the enduring effects of her presence. Written records often fail to capture the psychological and social nuances of her influence, while oral histories preserved emotional truth but left gaps in factual detail. The interplay of these sources reinforced the sense of mystery, illustrating that some aspects of human experience cannot be fully documented or understood. Her story existed both within and beyond history, a paradox that enhanced its power and resonance. Ultimately, her narrative remained a testament to the enduring impact of intelligence, awareness, and subtle agency in a world structured by hierarchy and labor. The plantation, while continuing its outward operations, existed as a space imbued with memory and influence, a silent testament to one individual's capacity to shape perception, behavior, and legacy. Her story became an emblem of the unknowable, the extraordinary embedded within the ordinary, a reminder that some presences leave traces that cannot be erased by time, circumstance, or absence. Even as generations passed, the unanswered questions persisted. How had she attained such extraordinary awareness? What had motivated her actions? Did her disappearance signify freedom, strategy, or something else entirely? No definitive answers emerged, yet the persistence of inquiry and the resonance of her memory ensured that her story would remain alive, a haunting and instructive echo across time. The plantation, its descendants, and the broader community continued to feel the subtle, enduring presence of someone who had challenged perception, authority, and the very nature of understanding itself. In the quiet corners of the fields, the empty hallways, and the stories whispered across generations, her legacy endured as an unresolvable mystery, a presence both absent and palpable, shaping consciousness and imagination long after she had walked among them. The echoes she left behind were neither fully comprehensible nor dismissible, a reminder that some forces, subtle yet profound, persist indefinitely in the spaces they touch and in the minds they influence.